who enjoy your content, who make fun of your mistakes and like give you money and put it in the chat, like,
Oh,
oh, that was
great.
funny when you did that or whatever. And people who like dislike you, they do the same thing. They'll put money
Of
like
course.
super chats and say, oh, you're so dumb for doing this. I'm like, thank you for the
Yeah.
donation. I appreciate it.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
the live seems to be the thing that works better. People seem to prefer the more genuine engagement than pre-recorded
Great.
stuff. All right, it looks like we're live. Put in the sound. Is the sound good? Question mark. Sound good. I always like to ask that to make sure everything's working because sometimes I've had it not work, which is bad.
Hmm.
So looks like we are good.
All
So
right.
David, thanks for coming on and be willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is David Lahti. I'm a biologist and philosopher at the City University of New York, and I run a behavioral evolution lab. So we're interested mainly in the evolution of behavior in particularly complex behavior, so learned behavior in, say, birds and humans especially. And this sort of dovetails with philosophical and psychological, anthropological interests, obviously, once you start talking about the evolution of human behavior.
Oh, that's cool. Do you guys work with crows a lot and do the like cognitive trainings to see if they can learn stuff?
We don't do that, but we read that kind of stuff. The bird behaviors that we look at most intensively are bird song, which is learned much like human languages by elder birds in the population.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that's really interesting. Another one would be like the cuckoo bird, like the innate ability when it's born to push out the other eggs. Like, how did it learn that?
that is amazing, and we actually study that too. I did my PhD on that behavior, or more specifically, the behavior of the host bird in attempting to foil the cuckoo's attempt to foist reproduction or parental care on the host.
How do they do that? Do they like recognize the cuckoo as
Yeah,
mate?
well, recognize it's really hard if you can imagine a bird mother being like any other mother. It would be very difficult to evolve recognition of foreign chicks. But at the egg stage, it's actually quite common. And so many birds can tell the difference between their own eggs and the eggs of the cuckoos that are laid in there. But sometimes the cuckoo evolves egg mimicry and so ends up evolving. And there are specific races of, say, the Diedrich cuckoo in Africa that parasitize only a given species or group of species of bird that have a particular egg color. And so, what then happens is like a coevolutionary interaction. What happens on the host side is they evolve um, very specific patterns, kind of like we do to foil counterfeiters, and also the ability to distinguish very fine differences in color that other birds cannot distinguish. And so, there's this, who knows at any point in the evolutionary process whether the host or the parasite is going to win, because it's an arms race. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Evolution is an amazing process. What do you think are the like scope and limitations of what evolution can and cannot do or explain?
Yeah, well, that's the big question, isn't it? But I would say I'm definitely on the adaptationist end of the continuum. I am always um, um, surprised at the explanatory power of evolution, even in areas that we may have thought it could not go. And I'm skeptical about evolution providing skeptical. I mean, in a radical way, I disbelieve in the ability of evolution to provide a meaning for life. We can accept or reject anything that it produces in us. Um, you know, but but when I look at a trait that has functional integrity to it, um, my assumption is that if I study that for enough years, I am going to be able to explain it with an evolutionary process, provided it was produced in an evolutionary process and not by someone's cognitive functioning within a generation. In which case, I may or may not be able to shed any light on it with evolution.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. Do you
yeah.
think there's like a size limit to DNA structure where it can be certain length and contain a certain amount of information, but no longer. Been researching a little bit into that. We're saying there's a maximum amount of information that contain, or else it becomes genetic entropy goes too high and it just decays automatically.
Uh, well, there certainly uh, are a lot of discussions about genome size, and their genome size scales with cell size. So if you have like a volant animal, like a bat or a bird, often there's a weeding out of DNA, so that genome sizes are smaller. Whereas some, logy individuals on the ground, amphibians, can have really high genome sizes. We have mechanisms by which we can deal with really bloated genomes. For instance, we can um, only transcribe certain genes and not others, or certain lengths of the genome. But I don't know if you're talking about whole genome sizes or the sizes of individual chromosomes. But yeah, that's an open question, and I am not, that's not what I don't study the molecular stuff like that. But it's a fascinating question for sure. Why do we have the genome sizes we do?
Definitely. And do you have a take on like there's a bunch of alternative theories of evolution or additions to evolution, like the Evo Devo epigenetics, neo-Lamarckism, process structuralism, all those different kinds of things. Do you have thoughts on those and how they relate to Darwinian evolution?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I like the history of science, the history of evolutionary biology, and so that has sort of pre-adapted me, to use an evolutionary term, to being one of these people who is on the side mostly of there's nothing new under the sun. And so long before Evo Devo became a thing, and I'm really glad it is. I think that development is a trait, it's a very complex trait, but it's a trait like anything else. And so the evolution of development is something that I am very glad that we're doing. Yet at the same time, C.H. Waddington and other biologists, even a century ago, had presaged or had some of these ideas anyway, or regardless. And I think that this means that we have to accept the fact that theory was a lot more well developed than some of those who are advocates for extending it today realize. I think it should be conceived as an add on, say, cultural evolution, epigenetics, um, niche constructionism. These should be seen as uh, areas of evolutionary theory that need more development, not as a basis for a call to revamp the whole thing. That's really the dispute. No one suggests that niche constructionism isn't important. What we differ on is whether it requires a reboot, in the words of some niche constructionists and epigeneticists, et cetera. So I'm on the side of we're doing well. If we need more theory, make it. Don't just sit there and complain about it. If R.A. Fisher or J.B.S. Haldane or Sewell Wright had just sit there writing 30 papers on how we need better theory integrating genes and evolution, that would have been really disappointing. Instead, they went and did it.
So you'd say that more the Darwinian natural selection and random mutation account for the vast majority of the species, and the niche constructionism and Evo Devo can have some effect, kind of like Stephen Jay Gould's, I forget what it's called,
Punctuated equilibrium.
yeah, punctuated equilibrium. Those have an effect, but the majority of the effect is more the classical Darwinianism.
I would even go so far as to say that, although I do happen to think that um, the um, that natural selection does explain natural selection of differing genotypes explains more than the other side of that cycle, where modifying your own environment influences the selective regime on you in most species. I think humans are an exception. There's lots of exceptions, social insects, anything that builds a nest or a dam or a hive or anything like that is modifying its environment in tremendous ways. So I do happen to believe that overall, that natural selection on differing genotypes is the most important functionally integrating um, half of the cycle. But what I was mainly saying earlier was that to add the other half of the cycle, the niche construction half of it, where you're modifying your environment, which influences selection on you, or plasticity start kicking off evolution. Say it's another way of cycles to complete. I think that is an add-on to the basic theory rather than requiring theory to start from scratch. That's all.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think that's a perfectly good way to look at it. I've talked with some theists who say, "Oh, well, neo-Darwinism is completely wrong because there's all these other theories." Like, no, those are the
Well,
same
that
thing. Just
and I know what you're talking about, and I have talked to those people too. And that is the old God of the gaps problem where, and I know you have well, I don't want to be pejorative and say a chip on your shoulder because I do too, about this idea of God of the gaps in the sense that if there is a God, then that God privileges certain mechanisms, scientific mechanisms or natural mechanisms over others. And I think that's just ridiculous. So some people love the fact that we can't explain something except for saying it's random because God's in the randomness. And other people say, oh, I love convergence because that means that God's in the natural selection. And it's like and so those people are actually at odds with each other, right? Those two ideas that God is in the randomness versus God is in the order. Better to um, uh, take it the way that the writers of uh, uh, Genesis, the early parts of Genesis, took it, which is that God is just the creator of everything, and so doesn't privilege one mechanism over the other.
yeah, the constant debate between is God violating the laws of nature or is he using the laws of nature? Like, ugh.
Yeah, yeah. Even and even in the area of miracles, that's a big debate that I wasn't even aware of for most of my adult life. That there are two positions on that. One is that the laws of nature are so unpredictable from our perspective here that we have such a partial, sort of like a Newtonian idea rather than an Einsteinian idea or something about the laws of the universe, that miracles actually fit into the whole thing. Uh, and I think that's fascinating. I never even knew about that until recently. I think I've even published somewhere that miracles are violations of the created order for a particular purpose. And now I have to, eat my words and say, okay, maybe miracles aren't that. You know, um,
Yeah, for sure. What is your position on like process structuralism? The idea that if evolution happened again, it would happen in a similar way because we see a lot of similar traits evolving, especially in like the ocean between dolphins and sharks and other kinds of sea animals.
yeah, and this used to be considered a sort of a purely philosophical or speculative enterprise, but now that there's astrobiology, in the sense of we're not only accepting the realistic likelihood that there is life elsewhere in the universe, but we're wondering um, uh, whether it would come out the same way. I think there are more and less reasonable positions on this spectrum. I don't hold a hard line view. I think it's just to be facetious for a moment. I think we can reject the Gene Roddenberry idea that there are beautiful human-like women living on every planet in the universe that all happen to wear leotards and fall in love with Captain Kirk. Um, on the other hand, I think that there are things about our use of the physical materials that we have in the universe that are remarkably um, versatile, like carbon and oxygen, and what happens when you create hydrogen bonds in water, and all the things that that cohesion does for us in terms of density and these things. I think that the way that we evolved in this protective environment of water and how there's an aqueous cell, a lot of these things could happen again, and I think there's good arguments for them happening again. But again, like quasi-scientific discussions about the nature of God and theology, um, by quasi-scientific, I mean you accept one big thing that you don't know, and then everything else kind of becomes almost scientific after that. You say, well, if God is like this, then this is what we would expect. It's almost like we're doing that with evolution because we only have an N of one. So the people like Stephen Jay Gould, who used to say that if you ran the clock um, again, something completely different would come out, or ironically, a big someone of whom Stephen Jay Gould was a big fan. Um, uh, oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name now, but he wrote The Runes of Evolution very recently, and Wonderful Life was essentially about his work at the Burgess Shale. Simon Conway Morris. Sorry, Simon. um, uh, Simon Conway Morris believes, unlike Gould, that if you ran the tape again, um, very much the same stuff would happen. Wouldn't necessarily be quite like Groundhog Day, the movie, but it will be very recognizable. There's a reason why we've sort of alit on four limbs. There's a reason why we've alit on um, uh, using oxygen in our respiration. Although if we use nitrogen, then you think it would be a lot easier, but oxygen's more versatile as a component of water. So I think, yeah, I think that evolution would have very notable similarities, but it does bug me when I see all these 6-foot hominids in all of or many of the sci-fi products of sci-fi imagination.
Yeah, for sure. I guess it's good for advertising, makes them more relatable, so you can actually care about
Yes,
them.
exactly. It's like, I'm just a human, except I have this big tattoo on the side of my face. It's a lot easier to do in a set, right? Makeup time is a lot less than if you are going to be this blob made primarily of silicon and you can't communicate vocally.
Definitely. Do you think the same thing? I've heard theories of molecular evolution. The same thing can actually explain the origin of life in some way. Do you think that was a reasonable explanation?
I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean about same thing as what?
It's an evolutionary process on a molecular scale. So the like the rate at which certain combinations of molecules can disperse entropy in some way, it can relate to the same way that how DNA can function in an environment to produce different levels of fitness. And that is kind of how the theory of how life may have originated in a similar way or through a similar process as evolutionary Darwinianism.
Right. There's a lot of, I don't know if you're getting at sort of self-organizing systems and that kind of thing, but there are aspects that seem to be quite fortuitous about the particular self-replicating uh, molecules that we happen to have. And maybe there were other self-replicating molecules that didn't make it, or other ones that were not likely to form in our particular reducing atmosphere of early Earth. And so I'll just go so far as to say that it's fortuitous that we have these systems that enable tiny mistakes to in molecular processes, in biochemical processes, to result in the proliferation of information that can eventually be, I was going to say translated. I mean, literally, that's the word, translated into proteins that can build all the organisms that we have on Earth. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, definitely. I think evolution is one of the most interesting and fascinating processes in the universe, bar
Oh
none.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So I actually got to know you from watching a few of your conversations about Christian minds and science.
Oh,
You talked a little bit about how it's the foundation of science, how it's based in a lot of ways from religious backgrounds, and the impact that religious minds have had on science. Um, could you? I think you've
good.
mentioned sometimes that it's important to have religious minds in science, and that it would be a detriment to lose that in some sense. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, I think. So what would we lose? I suppose if assuming that the public is still full of Christians or has a lot of them in there, then having that perspective not represented, I would say, is bad for us. And we can start with just the same as a question of having a discussion that involved issues that are known to vary, let's say, between the sexes on average. But that discussion, what would we say? We would have a discussion where only one sex was represented in that discussion, like let's say abortion or marriage or something like that. I think most of us would think that that would not be a very fair situation, or if there were other issues and we had no Latinos or African Americans or some other group that is represented in our society but is not involved in the discussion. But I would want to dissociate why these things are, why it would be unfair to have Christians excluded or not represented. And I'm not saying they're being excluded. I'm just saying, I was asked to talk about what, Christians add to a discussion of in science, but I think the answers to why I do think that they're beneficial, why Christians are beneficial in this exchange is, number one, that and this is what I was getting at just now, is that the pluralistic society is best served by the free and courteous sharing of ideas. And religiosity is, in some sense, the historical default. It's the natural state for humans as soon as we could think about these things or represent them in literature, for instance. And so they ought to be brought to the table. And then secondly, um, students have questions that go way beyond the bounds of science into metaphysical and religious areas. And in my experience, a lot of non-religious people are kind of ill-equipped to deal with those questions. They aren't necessarily ill-equipped, but just they happen to be ill-equipped, probably because they don't respect or know enough about the religious or metaphysical questions or ideas that are being brought up by the students. So they sometimes just sort of clamp down on them with their own view or something like that. And then thirdly, Christians can widen people's perspectives because they have a broad perspective on the universe. So it's an increasingly unusual perspective, I would say, in science. And I wouldn't say that there's something specific about Christianity here necessarily. I would say about other perspectives as well. I'm looking right now at this book on my shelf. It's Khalil Gibran. He's revered by millions of readers. I don't know anything. I don't know any quotes by him. I don't know what his perspective is, but I know that a lot of people really love him. Michael Polanyi is another one. I can't tell you how many times people have gripped my arm and said, "You have to read The Tacit Dimension" by Michael Polanyi. I have no idea what it says. Just this month, I read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and I don't think it, since Anna Karenina, have I ever changed the way I view things based on a book. It's affected even the way I'm going to be talking to you today in some way that I probably can't even tell. And so for this reason, we need Christians in academia, because Christianity has been a tremendous, awe-inspiring source of thought and changing of people's perspectives for the last 2 millennia. And, I don't have the wisdom to predict whether and to what extent a scientist would become better by reading a Christian author or reading the Gospels carefully, say. But if I were to make a bet, just from my own experience, like I was telling you, I would bet that it would make a scientist better, if anything.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it makes scientists more relatable. Having someone who shares similar ideologies you makes them easier to adopt the positions they're espousing. So I definitely think that having Christians in science is a great way to get Christians to accept, like evolution, for example. If there were no Christian scientists, there would be a much sharper divide between the young Earth creationist majority Christians and the,
oh my goodness, yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
But does being a Christian help you make new discoveries or something? Is there something about having a religious idea that can give us more insight into the universe? Or if we didn't have Christians, would we be able to make the same rate of progress? Or is it more just the social aspect that it has to do with the relational to the people who are reading the science?
Right. So I think there are two questions there. One is whether it adds something to a person's scientific inquiry, and then about the progress of science separately from that. So I would say that now that science has indeed arisen, if we were talking about before, or when it was struggling to arise, or when it was competing with sort of more, you could say, pagan or ideas that do not involve a fundamental monistic order in the universe, but that you would have to appease powers that might be fighting against each other. In that kind of situation, I would say that theism would be great for science. In the situation we're at now, where we can thank the theists of the past for the ideas you and I are sharing about truth right now, atheist and theist alike, the death of science is not yet upon us. So I think nothing necessarily would be added to a person's scientific inquiry. But I would also hasten to add that we would need to hold postmodernism at bay to some extent in order for this to continue to be true. So I can't predict how long it will be until enough people rebel against science and reason because it's racist or sexist or culturally superior or entails that wrongly that some people's ideas are false and that's demeaning to them. But we're not yet at that point. Many people still hold to ideals such as order in the universe and the ability of any human being with appropriate skills and aptitude to search and discover. So, yes, there's probably not a discernible difference between the average Christian and the average non Christian, their ability to do um, science. But if you, Tom Jump, and if you and your fellow secularists end up by whatever means being taken over by postmodernists who claim that science is just another narrative and doesn't offer any more reliable route to truth than any other narrative does, then yeah, I would say in that situation, that future situation, Christianity is going to become important again because it'll add a ton to someone's scientific inquiry.
Oh yeah, I
Uh,
totally think in that case, evolution is going to take over. Just survival of the fittest, the most natural selection, them out of the gene pool pretty quickly. If we do start to adopt the postmodernist view, but I don't see how, like, I think there were many kinds of monistic views that didn't involve religion, even at the foundation of science. Like at Aristotle and Plato, they had the two different schools. One was the like rationalist school, and one was the empiricist school, and they had those without a god involved, and so they still seem to be able to have grounds for science without a god in that sense. And it seems to be more simply the fact that because religion was so popular, and combined with a more singular kind of god entity, the monistic view, those two factors made it significantly more impactful to society than the atheistic ones, because it wasn't as intuitively obvious to people. But I think we can still get both of those from a purely materialistic scientific worldview.
I don't know if we could have gotten to it with one, but that's sort of water under the bridge. We don't. Again, it's sort of an n of one a little bit. Most of the science of cultures that were not theistic ended up being largely pragmatic and utilitarian, not universe explaining. And I would say that Aristotle's idea of the prime mover and Plato's idea of God as represented, say, in the Timaeus and other things. And I know he sometimes used the singular and sometimes used the plural. That's not really important to me. I don't know why a truly world-explaining science like that we had starting in the Renaissance didn't flow from Greek and Roman science. I am certainly not enough of a historian to be able to guess at that. But I would say, sure, there have been theistic societies that have not led to science, and there have been monistic societies that are not theistic that have led to something, or that have not led to science either. But then, and I do believe that something like science could have come out of an Aristotelian view. I mean, I'm amazed at what he did himself. Didn't really kick off very much in terms of biology. I'm surprised that we have to get all the way to the 19th century really to have the next major addition to our understanding of biology from my perspective, which is that it changes through time. I mean, I know there are some Islamic and even early Christian ideas that got pretty close to it, but not close enough to create a revolution.
Oh yeah,
Um,
that's definitely a really interesting point too, the history of evolution and biology, because for pretty much all of human history, we only see the same things. Bees come from bees, dogs come from dogs, to quote the Kent Hovens of the world. And so the idea that it was came from some diverse origin and there was real change is something that was really hard for humans to really get their head around. And so what was
mhm.
this? You mentioned the second big revolution, I'm guessing Darwin in the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying, so Aristotle realized that natural things could be studied and that they should be the same everywhere, which is a pretty big. Once you realize that, it's no wonder that he just went crazy trying to find every kind of organism and seeing how it works. But then to realize that those things themselves are a product of a process and that there's no natural resting place of sublunary matter, even with respect to biology, not only with respect to physics, which we didn't realize until later, too. I think that was the next major revolution in biology after that things were explicable, was that they change. Yeah, for me. But of course, I have reasons to. I'm being self-serving with it. I'm studying a really important thing.
Yeah.
With respect to what Christians could do, I, I have a more I have something. So you probably agree with what I said in terms of the social interaction. You might even agree with the past importance of a monistic or even theistic. Um,
Yeah, like what you said earlier, if you believe that there are gods and they're interacting in the world and you think you have to appease them, then you're not necessarily looking for some kind of law in nature or some kind of regularity in nature to interact with. You're looking for the regularity in what you have to do to get the god to do the thing.
yeah, but how about this? This is probably you might disagree with this one. This is a contingent or probabilistic contribution of Christianity, not a necessary one. But I would say that any perspective that has an objective value system embedded in it might add some things in to being a scientist in the way that, say, being raised by parents who love you might add to your emotional well-being as compared to being raised by people who don't love you. Um,
Can you
like,
give an example? Like what? How would that apply?
well, um, let's say intellectual integrity, just in particular, not falsifying data. Let's say we can divide the world up into 4 points on a continuum. Um, I know if it's on a continuum, then I'm not dividing them up. But let's just, for the purposes of argument, I'll divide everybody into 4 categories. There's the thoroughgoing evolutionist, so the nihilist who believes in no purpose to human life. The motivation for that person is not to get caught. I'm just going to, suggest this. Then the second one would be somebody like the way that you might be, say, which is a person who believes in moral facts, but is a naturalist. And this would mean you don't want to violate a deliberately accepted code, say. And then the third sort of level might be a superficial or cultural Christian who believes in heaven and hell and doesn't want to burn or suffer. So it's out of fear that person avoids doing something bad or intellectual dishonesty. And then there's what I would say would be the true um, religious person or Christian who believes in a purpose to human life and wants to be what he or she is designed to be. And this isn't only Christian. It's the we were talking about the Greek, so it's arete. But it's agape in the Christian tradition. So you have a purpose, and living according to your purpose is your highest calling. I would suggest that if there's a temptation towards a lack of intellectual integrity, though that 4-step ladder will also translate into a greater level at higher levels on that ladder of intellectual integrity. And so, for instance, if you were able to compare people who believed that humans have a purpose and that you should be living by it, you'll have a greater level of intellectual integrity in your scientific work than if you were a thoroughgoing evolutionist who believes that human life has absolutely no purpose. Now, and this gap would be the greater the number of generations that stand between the evolutionist and the religion of his or her ancestors because of social inheritance of morality. Now, I know we can't even trust this in 2020 because we don't know. Nobody knows where somebody is on that trajectory. Matter of fact, I have been on every single one of those rungs at some point in my life. Even my family didn't know. My friends didn't know. The only people who knew where I was were my wife or girlfriend then, wife now, and me. And I wouldn't have admitted it in a psychological study, even if it was anonymous. So we'd have to get damn better at neuroscience before we can really test that hypothesis. So it's almost not even scientific at this point. But that's what I would suggest might be a contribution of Christianity to scientific integrity, if you believe that you have a purpose.
Oh yeah, for sure. So if you have a group of people who value truth per se, and a group of people who value money more than truth, for example, and the one who values truth would be better at science, probably because they would be more honest in their papers, even if they publish more false results, even if it didn't cost them anything, and that could be a benefit to science. Whereas the people who cared more about money would publish only positive results just to get the results they wanted, like what we see in most political parties today, and their super PACs, where they just publish papers that support their position just because they want power. And so the ones who value truth would then make a greater contribution to scientific research than the ones who just wanted money, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it actually brings us to your other half of your question, which is would science progress equally or more or less quickly if there were more Christians in it, or people who did believe in all of these things that Christians believe in with regard to truth and and everything? But I don't know what I would say to that. I think we'd have to model it. So if 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 we had, everybody has a different attitude towards science and truth and goodness and God. If it so happens that Christians are more likely to be pro-truth and pro-goodness than atheists, say like if the postmodernists took you over, then I would say that science will move faster if they're Christians than if there aren't. But if it so happens that Christians are more likely to be anti-science because they have some wacko theology that sets science up against the Bible, then I have no problem saying that we'll move faster in our scientific understanding without Christians than with them. So it would have to be sort of modeled in a particular society or with a particular, you have to know what those Christians actually thought.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was contrasting, like, if we take the expanse of atheistic worldviews and theistic worldviews and see, well, which ones promote a kind of value system like you're describing, which ones kind of supersede it with something more important like money or adherence to literal biblical literalism or whatever. And there are lots of examples of secular societies that do value truth and have a moral code. It's not specifically about morality in many of them, but they do value truth and success and honesty. Those things seems to be universal human values, not just of humans, but through many different species. They seem to adopt these kinds of principles as betterment for certain social interactions in social groups across biology. So it seems those value systems are universal across many social species. And there are lots of different parallels of ideologies that have a value system for truth in atheism that don't involve a god of some kind. And like, if we look at most societies today, most are not postmoderns. Postmodern is a very niche thing that we don't like to talk about in the corner. But many secular societies today adopt many kinds of value system and are helping others, secular humanism being one of the possibilities. And so it's like especially even in the Greek and Roman empires, there were the Stoics who valued truth and nature, and they wanted just to adhere to those kinds of things. And so it seems like we can, any kind of system that has a value system that values truth would produce that result, regardless of whether it was religious or believed in a god of some sense.
Well, there's a lot there. I would suggest that you can uphold truth because of an ancestral metaphysic that you no longer hold, in which case I would suggest that that is going to decay over time. It might take generations, but that might be the reason for the fall of cultures. I mean, it might be the reason why why we can't draw a simple line between our own metaphysics and that of the Greeks and Romans. We like to think it's because we disproved them and we moved on, but that's not really, I think, realistic. It may be that once we lose the say the religious metaphysic of our ancestors, it's only a matter of time before our sort of shallow speculation collapses in on itself. And we may even be at this point now. As a matter of fact, some people thought that in the early years of existentialism. It's like, aha, this is what happens. This is what happens when you reduce God from someone who's involved in everything about the universe to a deistic view where he only kicks things off, and then he just gets killed off. And then you're left with the metaphysic, but the metaphysic can't stand without the religious underpinning. Where are moral facts? And that's what I would challenge you to say. Where are they? Show them to me. I think I'm more skeptical than you are. And so everything's doomed to collapse without a really robust, necessary being or existence or force or something at the base of it. So my evolution, as much as I love it, doesn't give me a reason to live or to like truth, goodness, or beauty.
I'm actually a moral realist, so I believe there
I
is an
know.
objective morality.
Yeah, and so that's why I'm saying, where are they?
Oh, I
Where are
think
they?
it's a higher order emergent property, kind of like fitness. So we know that fitness is an objective feature of reality, that certain organisms can survive in more environments than others, and there is some kind of pattern to that. And I think morality is the same kind of a thing. It's a higher order emergent property. Instead of fitness, which describes how organisms can survive in different environments, morality would be describing how agents can interact in certain kinds of environments. And you could hypothesize about like, well, what would be an organism that has the greatest fitness? It would be one that can survive in all possible environments. And so you can use that as a grounding point to say, well, here is the highest level of fitness, the objective measure. And you can do the same thing with morality. But what is the greatest moral standard we can have where agents can interact with an environment to whatever the moral principle is? I think it's any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. And so the objective standard of morality would be a world which has no involuntary impositions of will, and that would be our objective standard, and we can derive our morality from that standard. And so I think it's a higher order emergent property, just like fitness, and is
Well, I would say that fitness is doesn't do any work that the definition or the components of it already does. It's just a scaling up. Whereas morality, on the other hand, is in the words of Iris Murdoch, has this element of sovereignty to it. It's like it grabs us and tells us we ought to do this rather than this. There's this sense of duty or of some states of affairs that are better than others, and nothing below that, that from which it's supposed to be emerging, has that feature to it, because those are the stuff that we scientists study. And nothing that we study down there has that sort of sovereign grab on our wills, whether we accept it or reject it. And that's the reason why somebody like G.E. Moore could have the open question argument and says, whatever you say it's emerging from, whether it's pleasure or voluntariness or money or anything else, God's commands, whatever you're saying it's emerging from, I can say, eh, I don't care. But morality doesn't allow you to do that. The thing that actually emerges is this concept that even G.E. Moore is attracted by, you know, and um, and so how can you say it's emerging from things that don't have that quality to them?
right. So I would say our feelings of morality isn't the same as morality itself. So our moral intuition and moral progress would be the phenomenon that we are describing as the moral phenomenon, but it isn't morality in and of itself. I'd say morality in and of itself is an emergent property like fitness. It's not, we don't feel it, we don't see it. It's just describing something in nature that's happening. And then based off of that thing, it has these effects on us where we feel this moral pull, this moral intuition, moral progress in our society. And so I would make a distinction between our feelings, which are absolutely just feelings, and would not, or the oughtness of them, the sensation, the sovereignty sensation is a feeling within us. But the objectivity of morality that causes that feeling is a property of nature, like I'd say, like a law of nature, essentially.
Right. Yeah, I didn't mean, I'm glad you brought up feelings, because I didn't mean to come off like a non-cognitivist or an emotivist about morality. What I mean by the sovereignty is an intellectual recognition of what it means to say that something is good or right. That the meaning of that word has a weight to it. Sure, it's action guiding in the non-cognitivist sense too, and there are reasons for that. Um, and I wouldn't require everything that from which morality emerges to have that same quality. So I agree with you there. But I would say that the concept of morality is so weighty, it actually carries with it the idea that nothing could possibly be a higher court. And if it were, then that would be the moral thing instead of this thing. Now, in other words, it's an arrow pointing in the direction of more weightiness that has no end. And I do not see anything in nature that justifies my acceptance of something like that. So for me, it's got to be an error theory, or it's got to be that there is a purpose to human life that is not explained by evolution. Those are the only two reasonable options for me.
So that seems to be kind of like the contingency argument in a sense, where we have this kind of layered system of values, and then morality is what we use to refer to the top layer of that system of values. Uh, But for me, it seems more like gravity in a way. Like gravity is a force of nature. It pulls us all. It's essentially one of the strongest forces at a greatest distance. But I don't know, our sensation that it's the greatest force or of some kind doesn't seem to mean anything more than it has an effect on us more than anything else. I don't see how our feeling of that sovereignty isn't just a feeling. What do you mean by the idea that it's something more than that, the sovereignty quality to it?
So what I mean is that um, if someone is using the words the way that we generally use them, to say something is right or to say something is good in the moral sense of good means that there is no possible argument against it that wouldn't uh, be somewhat less than good. And it also means that any attempt to define it would be cheapening it. And that was G.E. Moore's point, actually. And it's actually for this reason that I've left ethical theory in the analytical tradition, because I think it is the project, essentially, meaning analytical philosophy is the project of cheapening goodness by removing the importance of wisdom from human life. It's the attempt to reduce goodness, whether logically, semantically, or synthetically, to something that is not it.
So what you said first, you said that you can't, if you have a moral statement, there's no argument you could bring against it to lessen it in some sense. Now, I
Well, there's
would,
no argument you could bring against it that would, if the only kinds of arguments that would trump it would replace that notion of goodness with another one.
right. So that I would question that. I would say that certain immoral things can be beneficial, like utilitarianism, but still be and so we may have a good reason to do immoral things. So I think that there can be a higher standard to morality or a different standard to morality. And like in cases of should we kill baby Hitler or something, like I think it would be immoral to kill baby Hitler, but it would be pragmatic. So it's immoral, but we should still do it. So I think there can, but I wouldn't call that morality. I would say that those two categories are different things. I think the morality of not killing baby Hitler and it being good not to kill baby Hitler is is the moral thing to do, but the pragmatic thing to do is to kill him. And so I would say that you can assess moral questions and supersede them with more pragmatic things, which are immoral. I wouldn't agree with that first statement you made.
Well, some people have the pragmatism, like Dewey and nowadays Kitcher have pragmatism as the root of all their notion of goodness. So when you say it's just merely pragmatic, I think what we would end up having then is a metaphysical discussion, a meta-ethical discussion, whether it's better when you say should kill baby Hitler, whether it's better to do that. And we'll have a conversation like Dietrich Bonhoeffer must have had with people who wanted to kill Hitler even when he wasn't a baby. Um, and so that discussion would be a meta-ethical discussion, would be a discussion of whether states of affairs or duties should be followed in this particular case. And I would love having that discussion if we could go back and talk about Hitler in that way. And I would think that if the states of affairs, the consequentialists won out in that argument somehow, and I don't know how we would judge that they won out, over the deontological perspective that says we have a duty not to kill, then there'd be nothing wrong about going and killing baby Hitler. I myself think that that wouldn't be the outcome, but but I don't have a complete view of goodness. And matter of fact, our incomplete understanding of what goodness is has led to these, you know, prima facie disagreements about, should I be honest with the Nazi and tell him that there's Jews in my
Basement.
attic, or should I protect life? It's precisely because the world is a complicated place and we have a very sort of off the cuff, seat of our pants view of goodness, and often these rules of thumb conflict with each other.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The fact that objective morality is an unsolved problem, we don't have a solution to it, and so we can definitely conflate different paradigms and say something that isn't moral is moral, and we should do it based off of this reason or this reason, and may have nothing to do with morality. So, based on my definition of morality, I think, which is involuntary impositions of will are immoral. By that definition, we can have good reason to do immoral things for pragmatic reasons, and I wouldn't call that moral. I'd call those immoral for sure because they
Right.
are involuntary impositions of will. Like killing baby Hitler in my worldview is always immoral, 100%, no matter what, it's always immoral.
Hmm.
But the pragmatic justification for doing it may outweigh that immorality. So I could say that a pragmatic justification to save a bunch of other lives, to prevent Hitler from imposing on their wills, gives us a reason to impose on his will, but it's still an imposition of will. It's still immoral in my worldview. So because I have a more precise definition of morality, I can say that it is immoral to kill baby Hitler, but there could be pragmatic, non-moral reasons to do it. So I think that it leads back to your previous. Go
If you
ahead.
think that we still should, if you think that we still should, then that suggests that you have just um, introduced a defeater when you say outweigh.
Okay, so in my worldview, morality is purely descriptive. The shoulds are something that comes after the fact. So if mine is like saying I'm 6 feet tall, 6'2", that's just a fact of reality. It would be a fact of reality to say killing is immoral. And the should part is the Kant's hypothetical imperative after we describe the fact. So you say I should, if I want to be moral, I should like not kill baby Hitler. But if I want people to not die, I should kill baby Hitler. So I distinguish between the imperatives, which are hypothetical in my model, and the moral facts, which are just descriptions of things in reality.
Mhm. All right. Well, we don't have to discuss your moral theory necessarily, but I would just say that it's the variety of moral intuitions more than their similarity that sometimes speaks to me a lot because I expect them to be the same, and when they're not, that's very interesting. And I believe that in order that we can't ethically theorize and have some simple wrap up definition, even descriptive, because the search for goodness requires fundamentally it's a lifelong exploration. But this is part of my broader metaphysics. A lifelong exploration. It requires wisdom and discernment. But then again, that's why I don't. That's why I'm not in the analytical tradition anymore. I mean, I am. I can't help it. But that's why I. It's sort of like a kid who decides not to do what his parent tells him. I'm disobeying the tradition.
Yeah,
And,
you mentioned that the variety of moral intuition surprises you more than the similarity. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
um, yeah, just the fact that we can have differences of opinion where we both think there is an objective truth of the matter. No matter what the cultural relativistic philosophers like Gilbert Harman say would like us to think, whenever a normal, ordinary person interacts with another ordinary person and has a discussion on a moral matter, whether transgender people should have the right to go into the bathroom that doesn't agree with their biological sex, say, both sides will act as though there is an objective truth of the matter, even though they disagree in the intuitions that they bring to bear to answer that question. And to some people, this means, oh, there must not be an objective truth of the matter. And to some other people, the answer is that there must be some lack of knowledge about the facts of the matter on one side or another. And there are maybe other reasons that you could give. The reason I would give is that the search for goodness is a lifelong process that involves the emptying of yourself. It involves some vulnerability. It involves patience and humility and wisdom. And it doesn't come easily. It doesn't come automatically. And it comes with a time of effort and introspection and thought, contemplation. And everyone is at a different point on that trajectory and people may have wandered off in various directions such that they are elevating certain values over others that they actually shouldn't if they saw the whole picture in a holistic way. So if if you just take what I view as that's my view of morality right there, there's no possible ethical theory that you could easily just sort of pronounce at any age and after any amount of theorizing about it, um, or uh, and so that explains moral disagreement, I think, better than either that people are just incorrect of the facts of the matter. And I don't know how you would take um, variety of moral intuition or diversity in moral intuitions into account in your theory, but
Well, I see
um,
it kind of like an answer to your first point where you say you don't have enough facts. I see our moral disagreement is kind of like disagreement of the shape of the earth or disagreement about the evolutionary mechanisms or what's causing evolution. People have different evidences that they're using to try to come to these conclusions, and they're incomplete. And if we have the correct evidences, we can have a solution. But even with a perfect solution, there are still going to be those people who think the world is flat, even if we had a solution. So I don't. But when you brought up the differencing in values, that seems to me to be a similar or almost identical to your first point about saying we have a difference in facts or we don't have the correct the facts to answer the question yet. How are those two different things?
well, because the differences in the facts of the matter are things that could be demonstrated or at least falsified if they were not facts, at least theoretically, by a reliable self-correcting process. And that is the definition of science for me. If it's self-correcting, if you could show it not to be the case, at least in principle. Whereas the values are not like that. So the value of human life, the rightness of my rearing my offspring with love rather than just torturing them or using them for my own ends, those things are a commitment on my part and are not themselves facts that could be demonstrated with a self-correcting um, process.
Yeah, I think I agree with your definition of science for sure. I would just say it's novel testable predictions. That's my the how I would just rephrase self-correcting
Novel,
process.
novel testable predictions, is that what you said?
Yep.
Yeah.
So, but could you potentially could values be verified in the same way? We could say that if this value system is more correct than this value system, there may be these testable predictions we can make about the future and how, or how moral systems may evolve in other planets. Kind of like you mentioned earlier about the process structuralism. We can evaluate or see different species on other planets potentially and see if the evolutionary process happens the same in many ways. Couldn't we do the same thing with morality and say, if the species on other planets have a similar moral system to this hypothesis, that would be confirmation or evidence leading towards its objectivity?
I think the most that could ever lead you to is to some sort of um, utilitarianism, some naturalistic uh, assessment of what would work, say pragmatism, say what would work for humans, or what would be productive of the greatest amount of pleasure, or productive of the greatest amount of, if you want to, you would never be justified. So I'm being rigidly scientific here. You would never be justified in saying make it right or more right, less right, one course of action rather than another.
Um, do you think, just a similarly off topic a little bit, do you think it's possible to have evidence of the supernatural in some sense?
When you say evidence, I do not believe uh, can disagree with someone that they say that the supernatural is evident to them in the same way genome, but many way of finding about the supernatural. In other words, I could have a number of views of the supernatural or the transcendent, and nothing about the universe hit me over the head and show me that I was wrong. Now I
Uh,
realize that I differ
you're breaking up.
arguments, arguments for the existence.
Could you try refreshing the page real quick? You're breaking up a little
Oh,
bit.
so if I refresh evolution,
Yeah, just try to refresh the page. It'll just automatically. Yep,
there.
that's better.
Okay. So I
It's still breaking up. I can't hear you at all right now. I don't know what's going on. Oh yeah, it's a little better. Mm, nope, still breaking up.
Going right beneath the router and hoping it's better.
Yeah, a little bit. Yep, I can see you and hear you now, so definitely better.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's see if this works. I still have my box, so I don't know why. From my Wi-Fi. But anyway, sorry about that.
Yeah,
My
you're
point
clear now.
was
I can hear
just
you.
okay. So, quick answer to your question. I cannot argue with someone who believes that the supernatural is evident to them. But in terms of a self-correcting way of finding out about the supernatural, I don't think there is. In other words, if I held any number of views about the supernatural, there'd be nothing about the universe that would hit me over the head and force me to realize that I was wrong. Like the way.
Ah, you broke up again.
Yeah.
Yep, you're breaking up again.
Oh crap.
Ah,
Um,
working so well for like the first
I don't know
hour.
what instinct.
Ah, yeah, I think it's breaking up. I don't know what it is.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Uh, I'll go upstairs, going. And you're always right. Obviously, it's on your side. So that could be part of it.
Do you have a
Uh,
cable, an internet cable you could just plug into your router and plug into your computer?
I um, okay, so this is on the same level as the. Oh, I just saw it was interrupting.
Yep.
Fresh.
Ah, can you hear me? I cannot hear you. Hmm.
Hey.
Hey, still breaking up a little bit.
Oh, I even changed my I changed to 6 to 5 gigahertz, so I thought that would help. But
Uh, I can hear you now at least, so I can still
okay,
make out sentences now. And your blacks, I can't see anything right now. I can't see or hear you. Black screen. Black screen. Can't hear you at all right now. If you can hear me, I think we should just try to like reconnect on a different day or something because I don't know if it's gonna work. Definitely lost connection there. But it was great having you on. Great conversation. I'll send you an email. Thanks for coming on. But we can't. Oh, now we have two.
all right. So I logged off and logged on again. Maybe that would Maybe that would help. Now we have a guest. Oh, we don't have a guest anymore. The dark guest.
Yeah, it's still breaking up. Just in case if it breaks up again, I think we can try to reconnect on a different day. But it was a great conversation having you on. In case you break up, I definitely would love to continue talking with you about morality next time for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and anything else, sure.
Definitely.
So
yeah,
is it still breaking up?
a little bit. We can try. Yeah, we can try again. Keep going. So if you want to pick up from where you left off, you said that evidence for the supernatural. You don't think there's anything that would convince you that would knock down evidence that would convince you of the supernatural existing. From my perspective, I think you could have evidence of the supernatural. Like if I predicted there is a God, and if I pray to this God, he will give me a gold brick or something, just to pick a random arbitrary prediction. And every time you pray to this God, you get a gold brick. I think that would be good evidence of the God existing. And so I think you can have evidence of things you can't directly observe in that sense. But I think the same thing could apply to morality. I think that if we can make some kind of testable prediction that we can just observe in reality, I think that could be a good evidence of a particular moral system being true over another.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that even if you received the gold brick, I'm not saying that there is no possible world in which there weren't evidence of the supernatural. That gold brick world is in our world. That's what I'm saying. I'm making an empirical statement that gold brick world is not our world. And but I would not refute anyone else's claim that the supernatural is evident to them and in such a way that my own existence is to me. All I would say is that I have not found any mechanism or process that I can use to determine the difference between a true supernatural belief and a false one.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I'm just saying it should be potentially possible to do so. So I think it's possible if we could discover some novel testable prediction, like the gold brick example, which is totally just an arbitrary thing I made up. That would be good evidence of the supernatural, and it could also be good evidence of a moral system too. I think the claim I'm refuting here is that you said that values can't inherently be verified through some kind of process like the scientific process. I think it definitely can be if we can find some kind of novel testable predictions, like the gold brick example would work for the God, even if we can't directly observe the God. Would you have a problem with that kind of a view? Like if we could make novel testable predictions based off of a moral system, would you accept that as evidence of the morality being true in some sense?
Well, doesn't actually demonstrate. There could be some other, like in science, we have to recognize the fact that there are other potential explanations for having a particular psychological state and then having something appear in front of you. Sounds like the quantum world, actually. And but I recognize that what you're saying is true. I'll just grant that for the sake of argument that you could demonstrate, or you could have a pretty good plausibility argument, a consilience of induction, say, about the existence of God based on evidence. But I would require that before I was ever able to make the same kind of comment about, or make the same kind of judgment about morality. But I don't know, I just might not have been able to imagine a gold brick type of example for morality. What would it look what would it look like to have proven that something was right? I can't even imagine what that test would be. The closest I can come is what I actually do believe, and that is that human life does have a purpose that is not derived from anything that I can discover about us naturalistically. And so goodness and rightness are just the way that we participate in. Oops.
Yep. Damn it. Still
again.
Breaking up a little bit. Yeah, I think we should take a break here, try and connect a different time. But it was great having you on. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again for chatting with me.